Thank you for those kind words. I didn't know about that quote from the New York, was it the New York Times? I'm gonna have to look for that. And it's really a great pleasure to be here because it's not just that this is the first conference of its type on this subject, it's because it's taken a lot of energy and organization to make it happen. So I'm very grateful to the Armenian American Mental Health Association for inviting me. And actually, I'm representing the Armenian Film Foundation, and I'm going to be showing you a few clips to kind of start us off and to give us a little some voices from the survivors themselves. The Armenian Film Foundation has this year, through the USC Shoah Foundation, launched a digital archive of Armenian genocide testimonies filmed by the late Dr. J. Michael Hagopian. His rare collection of testimonies were filmed over 40 years, and they included interviews of survivors. This collection has now been indexed so that we can search by all sorts of keywords, not just the name and the location of where people were born or where they lived, but to search by subject keywords of all kinds. It's this last capability which brings us to today's subject, the issue of post-generational trauma. Until now, we haven't had the capability of searching testimony by subject keywords. So issues which surround the subject of trauma and genocide, like rape, torture, survivor guilt, we haven't been able to systematically look through testimony to understand those issues better. We're at the beginning of understanding the particular experiences of Armenian genocide survivor experiences, and those experiences later translated into the everyday lives of survivors living here in America and around the world. What I want to show to you today is a 15-minute collection, a montage of 12 survivors from our Armenian Film Foundation collection. You can see all of the interviews on the USC Shoah digital archive. These people were born anywhere between 1898, that's the oldest survivor, to 1909. That's of the 12 I'm showing you today. The age of the people who were interviewed was between 74 years old to 88 years old at the time they were interviewed. So they were older, and that is a reasonable question to ask in the subject of inquiry is the fact that they're older and the way that they frame how they remember what happened to them, and part of an issue, part of how, the issues that they bring up. So some time has passed between the events which took place and when these people were interviewed. Now, I could have chosen any number of testimonies, but I chose these for particular reasons, which I'll briefly discuss afterwards. So let's watch this 15-minute film first. You will see some photographs interspersed amongst the testimonies because a few clips were taken from documentaries. We do have, however, the full testimonies of these survivors up on the digital archive. So let's stop a moment and watch about 15 minutes of Armenian genocide survivor clips. I'm sure for those of you who are related to survivors, some of these clips include details you've heard before. And the reason I chose these particular clips were to highlight a few points which are themes, in my opinion, of the Armenian genocide survivor experience. Many of these eyewitnesses saw decapitation and very brutal killings right in front of their eyes, as you heard, and the trauma of remembering the gore, if you want to use that word, the savagery of these events, which was committed in front of children for the most part, that is still with them. As in the case of Ahavani Der Sarkisian, who saw the child decapitated in front of her, and the panic of the people around her trying to, as she said, glue the head back onto the body. That was the memory of a child, and she took that memory to her elderly years. Just thinking about the memory is traumatic, but many were able to express the fear, like Serpui Elmasian. I don't know what it all means, she says. I don't know what it all means. Many survivors never spoke about their experiences until they were interviewed. Our collection represents a small fraction of the survivors. So the question is, what about all those others who kept silent? how did that silence affect them and their families? Many survived massacres, and they relive the memories of a close family member who did not survive. So there is also a theme of survivor guilt. We saw this in Garbis Dermanasyan's clip and Haig Baronyan's clip, who saw his sister go off, that last look he talks about, and Hagop Asadorian, who buried his little sister only to see her body the day after taken off by jackals. We see this theme of survivor guilt with Vartui Kateyan, whose mother asked her to leave her sister's body, or leave her sister before she had died, in a bush. And the mother said, I can't do it because I won't forget, but you, the sister, you will forget. But of course, Vartui Kateyan did not forget. All of these survivors carry with them guilt for many decades beyond the events in question. Survivors like Shake Shichadjian witnessed sexual violence. We have very few survivors who actually talk about rape, as it were, but they will talk about the bad things, as Shake does. Shake was 15 years old when she saw the bodies being violated, so she was old enough to understand what was happening. The challenge is that by using that euphemism of bad things, referring to sexual violence, many times when one is going through testimony, if you don't search by the correct keyword, you won't understand what that means. And so we're just at the beginning of having all these testimonies available so that we can also look at the nuances of language, the euphemisms that are particular to this genocide, and to understand what bad things mean, especially when a woman uses it, although men were also raped during the Armenian genocide. Without trying to read between the lines, we may lose important elements of the Armenian genocide experience. Sexual trauma, which has been renamed and called something else. There's also the theme of emotional blocking. Survivors like Niam Sukar, who is not Armenian, who was an Arab boy living in Deir Zor, he had managed to block out his experience until he was interviewed by Dr. Hagopian, and it was not until he was talking about what he saw that the emotions came back. This is a typical reaction to say, I don't want to talk about it, but in Niam Sukar's case, he went on to talk about it for another 13 minutes. The interview's not very long, but in it, he recounts the trauma of seeing Armenians in the Deir Zor desert. A number of survivors managed to use art and literature to process their emotions. The artist which I showed, Avadis Hansyan, he was one of them. He painted the memories that he had. Another survivor, Elise Hagopian Taft, published her memoirs, processing her experiences that way, trying to make sense of them for herself, and in so doing, sharing those experiences with the wider community. Alice Murgadichan Shipley is another example of a survivor who published her memoirs, which went into a lot of detail about the torture methods of the Turks, which she witnessed. Excruciating detail, which, as you didn't see a lot of her interview, but her whole testimony is done in a very mechanical, monotone way. She speaks without any emotion, recounting the torture that she witnessed. For her, it would seem that that was a way to deal with her experiences, both to write them out and to talk them out, but in a very mechanical way. For the survivors who process their memories through the books, testimonies, memoirs, and through art, it's possible, without any scientific methodology being used, it's possible that in sharing these memories, however difficult, it seemed to help them deal with the trauma. That is, by writing out their experiences or painting out their experiences, however you want to put it, that helped them to process what they experienced. But then there's the question, what about the many survivors who never processed their memories, who kept them blocked? That's the question that has yet to be answered. And finally, I ended with the clip of Girard Sukiasyan, who doesn't really know who he is. The orphan's experience has its own particular trauma. Many of the Armenian genocide survivors were orphans. They were children who may have memories of their parents, but were not exactly sure who they were, where they were born, or if they even had other family members. This leaves them with a precarious identity, you could argue, which was a theme throughout their lives, who they were. How would they deal with their precarious identity? How would they pass that on to their children? That's an issue for analysis and discussion. And a very last word, Asadorian, Hagop Asadorian, who says, what makes it more difficult for me is that I'm told that I'm not telling the truth, that my experiences are not credible. And so the whole theme of a lack of recognition or reparation, the question then is raised for these survivors, what effect does that have on their dealing with their trauma when there is not recognition and when they're told that what they're saying is not true? There's something to start with for this event today. A few of the voices of the survivors, many of whom are, most of them are now dead, but we have for posterity their voices, which I believe will endure. Thank you very much.